Nothing. It's not saying he has a weak connection. He left again. It's not saying he has a weak connection. Yeah. He left again. Now you're back again. Something seemed to happen when you went to share.
Shared.
So if it happens again, we'll see. We might just want to see your face.
Okay.
Now you're back again. If you have a slide, you can send me. If it happens again, send me your slides and we'll get them up.
All right.
You appear to still be going.
I'm sharing now. Can you see?
Yep, and we can hear. So we'll
Okay.
go with it.
All right. We'll hope it doesn't happen again. I'm going to cut to the chase, though. So of the 5 primary characteristics, it's the one at the bottom that is sort of motivates my work, which was this observation that some of the behaviors that we call essential to autism appeared to the observer to be anxious, to be obsessive, to trying to maintain sameness to limit spontaneity, and that rage or panic could be elicited if external conditions weren't met. I think this is a really interesting observation, and it's really put me on a pursuit to try to think about alternative reasons why we might see some of the behaviors we do in autism. And so I want to walk you through a few of these now. The first is around repetitive motor movements and doing biosensor assessment. So, there's no one consensus definition of repetitive motor movement in autism, but across various literatures that I have reviewed over the years, the best consensus I can come up with is what I've defined here for you. And this is that these are repetitive motor sequences, and this is important, I think, that appear to the observer, right? So this is perspective taking, to be invariant in form, meaning that every time it happens, it looks the same to us, to not have obvious eliciting stimulus, meaning it's not clear to us what occasions the onset of these behaviors, and that they have no adaptive function, so that these are not purposeful movements engaged in by the individual. Hand flapping, body rocking, and finger flicking are those that are the most frequent in epidemiological studies. And I'll say, and now I'll try to convince you, these 3 characteristics that are underlined, I think are wrong. And I think that, it's easy to say that. What's harder is to come up with data that suggests what the alternative would be. And so I want to walk you through a little bit how business is usually done in gathering data for this kind of behavior, and then some alternative hypotheses based on the data that we have acquired. So for those who haven't seen this behavior, here are 4 different individuals who I have permission to share videos for, engaging in the same class of behavior. We would all call these stereotypies or repetitive motor movements. And some of the things I want you to notice is they're all doing something similar in the sense that it's repetitive, but they're all doing it with a different topography, how it looks. They're doing it at a different rate, fast, slow. They're doing it for different durations. And potentially, putatively, they might be doing it for different reasons. What gets tricky is, I'll come back to that in a second. The way that we measure these behaviors are likely to guide how we conclude what constitutes them and why they matter or don't. The traditional way that most science in autism has looked at repetitive behavior is using paper and pencil rating scales, things like the repetitive behavior scale revised. This is a good measure, but it is potentially subjective. The parent is typically filling this out for their child. It can have questionable accuracy because they're basically using a heuristic. It asks a question about presence, absence, and how disruptive. You don't fill out this form on a minute-to-minute basis, so you do not get any information about intra-individual change in the behavior in terms of its form, amount, or duration. So it's really better as a global measure and maybe a pre-post measure, but not necessarily a functional measure. We can do direct observation of these behaviors, and In the published literature, the highest inter-rater reliability I have seen in autism for repetitive motor movements is 33% accuracy between two raters. And you have to think about this for a second. If two people turned their backs and guessed, they'd have a 50% chance of agreement. So humans are not very good at accurately identifying onset and offset of these behaviors because they happen very quickly. They transition very quickly. There can be a disagreement about when did an event end and when did it stop, and then clearly all the other distractions that are present in the environment that are vying for an individual's attention. A way to get around that, people have started to use video-based methods. So here you record the video offline, frame by frame, you go through and two different individual raters can timestamp and annotate. You see above 90% inter-rater accuracy when you do video-based methods. But I'll tell you, after having done this for my doctoral work and subsequent projects thereafter, this is a very boring task. This is a very tedious task. You have to remind graduate students why it's important and give them coffee and high motivation to complete these tasks, which means that it's not scalable. And so what I want to what this work is that I'll share with you momentarily is essentially trying to come up with a method that is as detailed and accurate as video, but would be easy enough to and scalable as doing something like the paper and pencil rating scale. Now, why do we care about more careful measurement? It's because of the clinical significance, and it's because of the consequences of our conclusions drawn from our data collection. So we know that if individuals engage in high rates of repetitive behavior, if you try to stop them, if you interrupt them, it can make them anxious and agitated and sometimes aggressive. If you're engaging in this behavior at high rates, you are also not demonstrating skills that you may have, and you may be signaling to other people that you're less capable than you are. So it can be socially stigmatizing and making it difficult for you to integrate in school, vocational, and community settings. It may also be interrupting you from taking in information from the environment and learning new skills or demonstrating your performance. And we've seen some data that suggests that some um, relatively innocuous repetitive behavior under stressful circumstances can actually um, occasion or morph into self-injurious behavior, which you could argue is as even of more clinical concern than social stigma. Um, in order for us to say anything about the characterization of the movements, are they changing over time? To say something about a putative mechanism or function, to consider whether or not we should be using behavioral, pharmacological, environmental interventions or reshaping these behaviors so that they're more socially acceptable. If we want to document the effectiveness of our interventions, if we want to compare and contrast different biologies within neurodevelopmental disorders where this is a clinical feature, or understand something about the underlying physiology that may maintain these behaviors. We need a efficient, objective, and accurate baseline measure and repeated measure to accomplish any of those goals. So we tried this by using 3-axis accelerometers. This is the common sensor that is in your phone that knows whether you're in landscape or horizontal mode. This is also what's in a Fitbit that does step counts. This is a relatively ubiquitous um, sensor now. At the time that we did these studies, there were not commercially available 3-axis accelerometers. One of my co-investigators, Stephen Antilli, had developed these and had able to stream Bluetooth. And so what you're seeing here is an example of one of our cases where an individual with autism in his school setting is wearing a accelerometer on his left wrist, his right wrist, and on his torso. And the video that you're seeing is time synchronized with the sensor readings, with the top time series is the left wrist, the middle time series is the torso, and the bottom time series is the right wrist. And then on the right, what you're seeing is basically the annotations being made by a human observer offline. What was the topography of the behavior, a flap or a rock or a simultaneous flap rock, and when did it start and when did it end? And what I want you to orient to now when you watch the video is when he flaps his hands, you see bursts of activity in the left and the right wrist. But when he rocks, you see these sinusoidal waves in the torso sensor. So if I had a clever way to cover the video up and just let you look at the sensor streams, based on this very brief kind of tutorial I just gave you, I would bet that the majority of you can agree, just looking at the sensor data, is he flapping? Is he rocking? When did he start? When did he end? How long did it last? What was the amount of time between the offset of a behavior and the onset of the other? And in that torso example right there, the number of revolutions of rocks and the speed with which they've been performed. So essentially, what we just visualized and described, we can codify in machine learning classifiers. So using a decision tree classifier, um, what we did was gave 50 examples of the labeled data to the training algorithm and had it learn features that best discriminated between no stereotypy, a flap, a rock, or a simultaneous. And then we did that in 10% of our data. Then 90% of the data that the classifier has never seen before and has no labeled data, we feed it to it and we ask it, what percentage of the time would you predict that there's stereotypy, none, or in each of those individual classes? And what our result essentially demonstrated was in the unlabeled data with those 50 examples, in the 10% for training, that the classifier was correct on average 90% of the time compared to the offline coded frame by frame ratings that were done by humans. And this had an 85% average true positive rate and only an 8% false positive rate. Now, what's of interest to this, which is really cool because this might be a way that we can, not sacrifice accuracy while gaining efficiency by building automation in detection and free a human up to do the interpretive value of why might an individual be engaging in these behaviors. One of the experiments we can do is combine everybody's data and leave one person out. And you train on the all but one and then see how well does the one generalize to the new person's worth of data that the algorithm hasn't seen yet. We saw a great range of variability. So for some, when you leave them out and you train on everybody else, it was still correct 95% of the time. But for others, it was as low as 17%. That suggests there's a lot of room for variance to be explained in terms of number of participants representing your data and the amount of stereotypical movements that you had um, observed with the biosensor. So we did a follow-up study with the same individuals 3 years later, where we could do some interesting experiments about training in year one, testing in year two, training in year two, testing in year one. And interestingly, our accuracy improved. That range is now 66 to 92% when we look at how well the algorithm performed with the same individual over a 3 year time span when that interval was not focused on intervening on these behaviors. We also basically mathematically um, sought to come up with ways that we describe intensity of a behavior, the duration of a behavior, the latency of behavior, the frequency of the behavior. And what's plotted, it's a busy slide. All you really need to see is that white cells show that there are no change in any of those kinematic parameters between time one and time two. Gray is a statistically significant difference of those parameters within an individual, time one to time two. And the takeaway is it's not uniform. Some people's behaviors and the classifier are constant across time, others are varying. That tells us something about the lack of um, change in how the behaviors are being produced, and or it is telling us that we might need to think about adaptive classifiers that update themselves over time. And so I made this data publicly available, not the videos, but just the video codes and the raw acceleration data. and the code that we use to train and to derive features and to do the prediction made it publicly available in a publication. About 4 months later, a group from the Netherlands had downloaded my data, reproduced our results, got in touch with me and said, had I considered recurrence quantization analysis with my data, that they had applied it. They got a 9% average increase in accuracy, and they could do it with one sensor on the torso, didn't require the two wrist worn sensors, and that their accuracy worked at a population level better than our individual trained classifiers. Then sent the data and their code, not the data, sent their code to me. I could reproduce their finding, and we jointly published a manuscript. I'm mentioning this because I really think this gets done a lot in the computing sciences. We do not do it so much in the behavioral sciences. I see a lot of value of sharing data with colleagues without fear that they're going to scoop us or they're going to publish without us. They have different questions and different analytical tools that the person who collected the data may not be aware of, that could be brought to bear in a common interest in advancing the state of the art. And so this was a powerful experience for me, and I want to suggest to others that you consider this too. Crowdsourcing data may move our field along faster than every one individual investigator being the only person who analyzes a data set. One more piece of work around this area, and then I'll transition to another area. This was now considering what role that physiological arousal and autonomic regulation may play in stereotypical motor movements. This has been posited back in the late 60s, early 70s, that some individuals may engage in these movements to regulate their stress, up or down regulate stress. So we wanted to take a good look at this because those early studies were primarily correlational. They were taking heart rate, they were looking at people's rates of movement, and they were saying how dependent are they on each other. What's nice about the data set we have is we can go frame by frame, moment by moment. A subset of those participants were wearing a Holter monitor where we had high resolution cardiovascular and respiratory responding. And so we wanted to look at what is the cardiovascular system doing before, during, and after engagement in these behaviors. And interestingly, across these 10 individuals and these 4 different classes of behaviors, they all seem to demonstrate the same canonical waveform where their heart rate is changing 4 seconds prior to the onset of the behavior, lasting until 10 seconds after. And a 5th order polynomial described with very high fit indices all 4 classes of behavior across all 10 individuals. To make this a little bit more clear, what you're seeing now is that same individual. What we're plotting is what's in real time with the video, what is happening cardiovascularly. Now, this is shown in heart period, which is the inverse of heart rate, so I know that's a bit confusing. When heart period goes down, the heart rate is accelerating. When it goes up, it's slowing down. And basically what I hope you can see from this video is that heart rate is changing prior to the onset of the behavior. Heart rate is increasing before he starts the behavior. Once it hits its max peak, that's when you get the behavior onset. And then once he engages in that behavior, his heart rate starts to decelerate, almost like he's blowing off steam would be one way to think about this. And then at the offset, his level subsequent to the movement is lower than the baseline that initiated the behavior. This said to me and to my colleagues that having something that is repeatable across individuals suggests that this might be a true mechanism for some individuals. Now, I don't want to make the statement that all stereotypy is related to autonomic regulation. This may be only for certain individuals or in certain contexts or phases of their life, but it does not rule out the putative mechanism that these are intentional behaviors with a purpose for the individual. Okay. So I'm going to switch now away from repetitive behavior and want to focus on challenging behavior. So when I say challenging behavior, this is what the literature typically is referring to as aggression to other people, to self-injury, to property destruction, and to elopement, getting up and fleeing without notice. Um, these kinds of challenging behaviors are really impacting quality of life. I've spoken to many parents who say, autism, no autism, I can live with autism. What's difficult for us is that my child can't participate in typical school, social, and family activities because we never know when he or she is going to engage in one of these aggressive acts. And the consequent of that is people tend to be afraid of that child. This can be parents, this could be clinicians, this could be uh, just our friends in society. Um, 2 out of 3 youth with autism display aggression, and it's one of the primary reasons why they come to the attention of behavioral healthcare services. It's clearly putting the individual and others around at risk if these are not well controlled. And families will report that the stress caused by their inability to predict these behaviors and manage them creates um, isolation, financial burden, and available support options in the community for them. So not only is it causing distress for the individual who engages, but the caregivers who are responsible for them. And we know that aggression is particularly impairing and hard to intervene upon in the 30%, 40% of youth with autism who have minimal verbal ability. Their inability to tell us that they're feeling distressed can lead to these behaviors seemingly without any warning, um, like they're coming out of the blue. And sometimes we can see these behaviors what appears to be long after any kind of observable trigger. So it gets very difficult for a parent to understand what caused you to reach the stage that you feel like these behaviors are necessary for you in the absence of them being able to describe their experience. There have been a lot of different factors that we have considered. I know Jonathan researches this area as well. Um, it can be language related, it could be cognitive related, it could be inhibition, executive function, it could be affective and social, it could be sensory, it could be biological. And that's what I'm going to focus on. I want to be really clear. I don't think that any of these are necessarily wrong. I think these, for a given individual, it could be all these factors that impact ability to regulate emotion and might lead to challenging behaviors. Or for certain individuals, it might be just a subset of these different factors. There are definitely individual differences in what might be mechanisms that give rise to challenging behavior. What I want to, and so make clear our conceptual framework and also connect it back up with the strength-based approach that Jonathan was talking about. Typically in the literature and in clinical conversations, historically speaking, challenging behaviors in autism have been described as oppositional, defiant, escape, avoidant, and in some instances forensic, meaning that these individuals who engage in these behaviors may take some pleasure in the consequences of them. I would like to, based on my clinical experience, put forward an alternative explanation that these are not willfully bad kids taking pleasure in engaging in aggressive behavior, but instead these are maladaptive attempts to express or modulate the physiological arousal due to distress. That these are fight or flight responses. These are coping responses. This is what any mammal who feels that its safety is threatened will engage in this behavior to remove themselves or confront whatever that distress trigger is to maintain their own equilibrium. And we know that physiological activation is implied in aggression that we see in um, antisocial behaviors, in some forms of psychopathology. that and internalizing and externalizing behaviors, physiological arousal and its regulation are core features. And one of the things that I get worried about clinically is that if these behaviors are punished or their function isn't satisfied, that physiological arousal is increasing and regulation is not occurring. And you can get stuck in this escalating loop of distress, arousal, and aggression. And response blocking, restraining, secluding, and medicating may address the symptoms of challenging behavior, but it is not necessarily helping with the root causes. And so this work is really motivated to see, can we record physiological arousal and demonstrate that it precedes aggressive behavior? And if so, can we use that change in physiology prior to the onset of these behaviors to predict a challenging behavior's occurrence before it happens? With the belief that if we can predict them before they happen, there are a number of affordances for the individual and those in the environment to preemptively prepare, either to self regulate, to provide more support in the moment, um, to cue someone to take a deep breath, to relax, to maybe change their activity. Basically, try to reduce the distress that may lead to the challenging behavior, so that that individual feels like they can cope and their needs are met without having to engage in an externalized behavior. So this work has been performed through the Autism Inpatient Collection. This is a special collection funded by the Simons Foundation, where there are a network of 6 different inpatient psychiatric hospitals across the US who have adopted a common um, data collection infrastructure on clinical practice. So these are patients who are getting admitted to inpatient for clinical reasons, and during their length of stay, standardized measures of autism and language and cognition, and then in this instance, specialized systems can be deployed in a hard to reach population. In the published literature, we know much less about more severely impacted individuals with autism and those who engage in challenging behaviors. It's a difficult population to study in a laboratory setting. So they're underrepresented in our data repositories. The inpatient collection is intended to be a high throughput, unique setting where we can gather large amounts of standardized data that help us improve our understanding of this understudied segment. It's also, I thought, a good place to safely look at relatively difficult behaviors in a naturalistic environment where we've got people around who can provide support, and to really be thinking about underlying emotional or behavioral symptoms, because we can get additional forms of data collection that informs whether our intervention approaches are being effective. The sensor that we have used is commercially available. It's called the E4 by Empatica, and this is what our study participants, our inpatients, are wearing. It's a device that records cardiovascular data, so heart rate and heart rate variability using photoplethysmography, which is basically optics shown um, through the top side of the wrist, and the refraction rate of a red and a green light are giving us an indication of pulse transit time. There's a 3x accelerometer, like I showed you with the stereotopy. It's also got a thermopile sensor, so that gives you ambient temperature on the skin. And then it records electrodermal activity under the wrist, which is a measure of sympathetic nervous system arousal, or the rate at which eccrine sweat glands are producing sweat to the surface of the skin. So all of those measures are being obtained and stored on the device without any other wires. And the sensor can also stream through a Bluetooth socket to a Bluetooth receiver on a phone or at a computer, and you can view the data in real time. In addition to the participants wearing the sensor, we then give clinical staff a custom-made mobile phone application that has time synchronization with the biosensor, where a clinician can opportunistically identify when did someone engage in an aggression, its onset, offset, self-injurious behavior, emotion dysregulation or a tantrum, or some no. In our first pilot study with this methodology, we saw 20 individuals with autism between 6 and 17, 85% of which were minimally verbal, in one of those inpatient sites. And 69 different independent naturalistic observation sessions were carried out. And we were able to demonstrate that using 3 minutes of biosensor data from the past enabled us to make a prediction 1 minute in advance with 70% accuracy if we treated everyone's data as one model, or up to 84% accuracy if we trained predictive classifiers based on each individual's data. Subsequent to that work, with some funding from the Simons Foundation and the Department of Defense, we have been able to increase our data corpus up to 70 inpatients with autism, independent from the previous 20, in 3 different clinical sites, where we've been able to collect 429 data collection sessions, which is over 500 hours of biosensor and mobile annotation, wherein we observed 6,665 naturally emitted challenging behaviors with concurrent biosensor data. And we also extended from just looking at aggression to others to also self-injurious behavior and emotion dysregulation. And about 9% of our corpus is aggression to other, 31% is emotion dysregulation or tantrum, 60% was self-injurious behavior. And our current results are in this larger sample are essentially demonstrating about 80% average global prediction accuracy up to 3 minutes into the future. And we can look at this in terms of each discrete behavior, our accuracy making a prediction and combining them. We're getting into about 0.78. We can use what you see in the bottom left. We can use accelerometry as a proxy for the intensity of the behavior, whether it's low, medium, or high. And you'll see that we're in the 70 to 80 range. And what's important to me too is that the really intense behaviors, the high class, we're doing better there than in the low. So when we're missing the smaller intensity challenging behaviors, not the large intensity. And then the top right, what that's showing you is test-retest reliability of the classifier within an individual over time. And again, we're hovering at about 80%. We continue to collect data. We continue to refine our algorithms. And we are now starting with a prototype to look at what would it take to transition from offline collection training to real-time data analysis and real-time prompting, to develop a just-in-time adaptive intervention that could run on a mobile phone, where we could push real-time challenging behavior risk predictions to a mobile phone that an individual who engages in the behavior can see, or a caregiver could see. And we'd like to do a trial where we put this into a clinical practice and see if giving alerts versus not giving alerts impacts the subsequent frequency, intensity, duration of the behavior, but also can be used by the individual or a clinician to initiate de-escalation or emotion regulation strategies that may prevent the onset of the behaviors or reduce their impact or enable an individual to recover more quickly after an event has occurred. Okay, I'm wrapping up. This one's quick. So I'm going to transition now into a different environment. So I've talked about schools and I've talked about clinic, and now I want to talk a little bit about the home. So this was a study also funded by the Simons Foundation, where I had the grand challenge of taking off-the-shelf commercially available cameras, microphones, biosensors, and seeing if we could create a in-home protected wireless network where a family could record ultra dense longitudinal audio, video, and physiology in daily life as it's lived, with an accompanying application that lets a parent review the data they've captured, mark or identify clinically relevant behaviors, or scrub their data and delete it before passing it on to researchers to protect privacy. Over the course of deploying that technology, we were able to put this equipment in the homes of 20 families with varying backgrounds and social economic status across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. There were each family had a child with autism between 4 and 14 years old, 4 of whom were female and 16 were male. And there was quite a range in terms of verbal and nonverbal abilities. In the course of deployment, we obtained 406 days of video, which is 2,000 plus hours from all 20 families. And 80% of that video feature has a person or has motion in the scene, as detected by computer vision algorithms. We also deployed a Q sensor, which was a predicate to the E4 I just showed you, a biosensor, where we got 203 days worth of data over close to 300 hours from 14 of those families. And when we do automated assessments of signal quality, 75% of the electrodermal activity tracings meet criteria for valid data. And then at night, they were wearing a biosensor that is a sleep sensor. It looks at motion and ambient light in a validated set of software for analyzing that data, obtained 116 nights worth of sleep data from 12 families. So it tells us something about sleep onset, offset, and uh, non EEG based quality metrics of that sleep. To give you a sense, I mean, I hope maybe those in the audience can see, one of the grand challenges. So great, a lot of information, but it would take you 2,000 hours just to review your data, let alone to code it, segment it, and ask questions about causal relationships. There are great advances happening now in computer vision. I'm just demonstrating to you quickly from real data from one of our homes that I have permission to share. These classifiers can automatically identify how many people are in the scene and where they're moving, which is no small feat given that none of these people have the same body shape. They are all wearing different clothes. They're in different distances from the camera. You should see with those bounding boxes, it's doing a pretty good job of discriminating even when you have overlap. So we built an interface where we could then bring in the video and then visualize in time when you scrub through the video how many people are in the scene through computer vision, how much motion is detected through computer vision, what is the magnitude of acceleration of the movement as recorded by the biosensor, what is the skin temperature and the electrodermal activity that's coming from the sensor, and then how much ambient sound or volume is in the back. And I continue to do work in my lab and with other collaborators on annotating this data set so that we might use it as training examples for a machine learning classifier to automatically detect clinically relevant behaviors. That's what I would call supervised machine learning. Or we can also try unsupervised. So if you basically throw this unimodal and multimodal data at a classifier, wherever it detects recurrence, it can then bring that instance up in our interface, and a human can then provide a label that describes that behavior. This would be one way where we can not have to just summarize the data. We can take full value of its volume and its complexity, but through man and machine interaction, do this in an efficient way without sacrificing quality. So I am wrapping up. What I hope I have conveyed to you is promise in telemetrics and computing and artificial intelligence, enhancing biobehavioral assessments in autism, that there are affordances to reduce reactivity, to increase compliance, to be less biased in who's represented in our data sets. This technology can increase ecological validity and facilitate longitudinal designs. It may help us to provide objective measures that compensate for communication limitations, that we can be thinking about stress and arousal and the role that it plays in our interpretation of behaviors in autism, inviting us to explore normal and abnormal biological mechanisms within autism and in other neurodevelopmental disorders, to appreciate that there are vast individual differences in autism. And so one setting and one measure does not adequately capture the uniqueness of individuals, and that telemetrics may enable us to do that better. And if we could do that, could we tailor dimensions of our interventions so that they're more personalized instead of a one size fits all? Can we have more tailored interventions for given individuals' strengths and weaknesses? I think there's also some research advantages that if we have more quantitative descriptions of our participants, we can stratify better and oversample for clinical trials. So we're not always mixing apples and oranges. Um, just because everybody has the autism label, we know full well that they can present very differently. These may also be good additional outcome measures in clinical trials. So not just did the intervention work or not, but when did it work and for who and for how long did it last? And then specifically to the physiological, are the drugs that we are being used in clinical practice, are they reaching the peripheral nervous system that might account for changes in observed behavior, or are we just sedating people? I get somewhat concerned that we can reduce repetitive behavior, restricted behavior, and challenging behavior through medication, but oftentimes um, they're basically just creating lethargy in individuals, and then they are not able to attend, and working memory takes a hit, and they're less socially interactive. So I'm not always sure the benefit outweighs the cost. Clearly, many people are involved in this research. It's not just me. I am grateful for those collaborations and the families who participate, and funders of this research, the Simons Foundation, the Nancy Larry Marks Family Foundation, Autism Speaks, the National Institute of Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Defense. And my parting slide, we have a program at Northeastern. It's the only one in the US that is patient facing in health informatics. Of the 32 doctoral programs in the US, most of them focus on electronic health records, data mining, information flow within hospital settings. We have tried to create a program with faculty and students that is looking at sensing technology and machine learning from the perspective of the patient, not so much the perspective of the provider. And we liked interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And so if there are folks in this audience who wish to learn more or would like more training at the intersection of disciplines for the benefit of healthcare, we have a program for you and we'd like to talk to you. Thank you.
We can take a few questions if people in the audience here or online. Go ahead.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you for that presentation. I just wondered if any of the, I guess, patients that you worked with, did anybody have epilepsy?
Not while we recorded. Some have that as a part of their clinical notes, but I have not had a seizure that we're aware of that occurred while they were wearing the sensor. Although I will say that Empatica, who makes the E4 and also the Embrace, and full disclosure, I'm a scientific advisor of that company, so I don't get any payment or royalties from that, but I do have a relationship with that company. The primary reason why they created that sensor was so that they could do seizure detection and ultimately prediction. So I think that there is utility in peripheral nervous system measures for seizure detection outside of clinical settings. I'm not sure if that answered your question or you were asking for a different purpose.
No, I just wondered if you had looked at that at all, because we see aggression just before sometimes a seizure.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I'm glad you said that. So something else that I think a lot about is we're demonstrating that we can detect physiology prior to what we observe as challenging behaviors. That is a functional benefit, but it doesn't mean that I know what occasioned the change in physiology. And it may very well be different for different individuals. It could be endogenous or exogenous. It could be proximal, it could be distal. For some, it could be recent absence seizure. For some, it could be a poor night's sleep. For some, it could be a GI issue, reflux or heartburn. For some, it could be ruminating on what went down on the bus before you got to school. For some, it could be loud noises or smells in the environment, or being requested to transition to an unpreferred task. Those are going to be highly variable within and across individuals. And so I think we need to remain humble, that seeing a change in physiology preceding it doesn't mean you know the cause of what onset that behavior. But my hope would be, as people continue to use a system like this, we can start to overlay those other sources of data, and sort of help be thinking about what function, what is the setting event or the antecedent or the trigger for this behavior. And then also, once we understand what might be occasioning it and when it's likely to happen and when to intervene, working with interventionists and healthcare providers of, if you get this notification, what's the best thing to do to provide intervention in the moment. I see just as many potential for individual differences in what occasions these challenging behaviors as I do in what's the best way to respond to them.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Really enjoyed your talk. It was really fascinating. My question, though, is we have these challenging behaviors. In all cases, I mean, and this goes on, is it appropriate for us to intervene? Maybe there is some other purpose for these challenging behaviors, and intervening could be possibly more detrimental. We're intervening because we see them as a problem, but maybe there's another purpose for them.
Yeah, I think we should all maintain that openness. Clinically speaking, and again, I'm working with the more impacted segment of the population, I feel that way more about restricted and repetitive behavior than I do about challenging behavior, in the sense that I have worked with individuals who have denucleated their eyes, who have chewed off their lips, who have been removed from their home setting and are wards of the state, who have significant consequences that diminish their independence and their self-determination and their self-esteem, because everybody is so afraid of them that they're not given an opportunity to demonstrate skill sets. So we're never going to be able to talk about a one size fits all, I think, in autism, and certainly in these behaviors. But challenging behaviors, if it's mild, I'm not sure we would call it a challenging behavior. Once it reaches the level of clinical attention, it usually means that if it is not addressed, it is doing damage to the individual or their likelihood to succeed independently.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. We really appreciate your taking the time to come to be with us, and hopefully you can join us for some of the rest of the conference. I'm sure people will come into the virtual room and want to talk to you.
Great, thank
So
you for having me.
much. Okay, look forward to talking to you.
Me too. Bye-bye. Thanks all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that keynote address, and to Larry for your introduction and facilitation. I'm now going to welcome back Cheryl, Kim, and Jacqueline to lead us through a bit of a stretch break. And then following the stretch break, we can top up on coffee, snacks, tea, and then back in our seats at 2:20 for our next keynote speaker. I'll pass it over to you.